Thank you, panelists and audience, for joining us in the ongoing series sponsored by the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture. I'd like to thank them for sponsoring the series. I'd like to thank the National Endowment for the Humanities, who's supporting this series financially. So we'll just get right into it. Tonight's panel discussion is entitled Indigenizing Archaeological Thought and Practice. So we have on hand with us tonight Kurly Tlapyoyawa. He's Chicano, Nawa, Mazewalli. He's founder of the Chimalli Institute of Mesoamerican Arts. We have Wade Campbell, who's Diné. He's a Ph.D. candidate at Harvard University. We have Tim Wilcox. He's a PhD candidate at Stanford University. He's Diné and Okewinge. And we also have Nick Laluk, who's White Mountain Apache, and he's assistant professor of anthropology at Northern Arizona University. So tonight we'll be talking about a new generation of Indigenous scholars that are challenging the colonial frameworks that continue to deeply influence institutions of knowledge and power. The burgeoning field of Indigenous archaeology offers broad critiques of Western and colonial archaeological thought and practice while fostering archaeologies, and that's plural archaeologies, not this one kind of archaeology, that are respectful of Indigenous peoples' experiences, beliefs. So tonight we'll have panelists who can demonstrate through their own unique lived experiences as Indigenous people, how the field of Indigenous archaeology operates as a broad spectrum of approaches, not just one single approach, but several approaches that promotes and prioritizes, indigenizes cultures and values. So to start off, I'll just let the participants, the panelists, kind of reintroduce themselves, talk a little bit more of the work they do, just to familiarize yourselves, the audience, with them. And then we'll go into a series of questions that I'll present to the panelists. We hope to end the discussion around 6 o'clock and open it up for questions between 6 o'clock and 6:15, where we'll end. So Wade Campbell, I'll turn it over to you to just reintroduce yourself and talk a little bit more about the work you're engaged in and anything else you'd like to mention.
Thank you, Woody, for the invitation. And thank you to everybody for being here. Wade Campbell, Beligana Bush's chain Hana Dash Che, although Beligana Dash Nala, Kitsili Dan, although not the Georgia Dan Nasha, although Tempe de Shakan. Hello, right, again, my name is Wade Campbell, as I said earlier, and I'm a Navajo archaeologist and PhD candidate at Harvard University. My work focuses broadly on Navajo history, really, as I see it, both in the recent past and going further back into time. My dissertation research has revolved around the particular theme of trying to better understand early Navajo pastoralism, that is the sort of sheep herding tradition in Navajo culture that is tied to the things like weaving and some of these other hallmarks of Navajo culture as it's kind of commonly understood by a lot of people. That early adoption and the transition from being, farmers, hunter-gatherers, to being kind of the sheep herders par excellence of the Southwest is a really interesting transition, and one that the start of which that early uptake hasn't been well understood at all, in part because Navajos really weren't colonized until the 1860s when the US showed up, right? For about 150, 200 years, Navajo people existed outside the realm of Euro-American influence. And so as a result, our understandings of that same period that, say, you have for Pueblo folks or Hispanic New Mexican folks in the same general region is much poorer. And it's something that I think you see with, say, other groups sort of on this periphery of the colonial world. And I think, with that in mind, for me, what drives me in doing this work is I think, an Indigenous archaeology is a particularly powerful way of engaging with and reclaiming Indigenous histories, recognizing that how we view history is in many cases things that are written. It's a textual focus, but Native peoples in many cases weren't writing, and the record is biased at the very start from that way. You have one side of the story and not the other. And I think archaeology is really important because it has a really unique capacity to shed light on the lived experiences and daily interactions of people that can then be tied into those existing narratives and problematize them, challenge them, and shine light on new areas. And one of the things that struck me in hearing Woody's introduction too was that, I think this reclaiming Indigenous histories is really powerful because it ties into this issue of archaeologies, right? That my interest as the person and my approaches towards archaeology, there's a train nearby. There are some things in common with other tribes, but there are also elements that are very different. And to sort of proceed with that overall goal of reclaiming histories and acknowledging different cultural backgrounds means that different approaches might need to be taken by certain groups, and to be mindful and aware of that is a really important lesson that I think folks that are engaged in archaeology, in particular, engaging with this broader Indigenous archaeology, need to keep in mind. So I'm really excited to be here and to kind of talk and share some of my thoughts on this. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Wade, for that, for those comments. Tim, if you will, just reintroduce yourself, say a few words, just reintroduce yourself to the audience. Be great.
Tim Wilcox, Inishia, Torachitni, Nishle, Kintlachitni, Kis on and Gi Bashichin, Naslane, Second Fox will ye Dashiche, Do Tabaha Dashinale, Besinil Nasha. So I'm Tim Wilcox. I'm Navajo, born for the Bitterwater clan, and my father's side is Okewinge Pueblo. My maternal grandfathers are Second Fox, and my paternal grandfathers are Edgewater clan, which is another Navajo clan. I'm from Winslow, Arizona. I'm a Ph.D. candidate at Stanford University, and my dissertation research is on Gomendador polychrome pottery that was produced during the Pueblo Revolt era in our like what we conceive as our homeland, our place of emergence, called Diné in northwestern New Mexico. It's sort of the same area where Wade is working, but I'm working probably like on a time that's like probably a century earlier. And my research is sort of personal to me because I'm a potter. I've been making pottery since I was very young, and I've had the experience of learning from many different people. First learned from a Hopi-Tewa family in Winslow, Arizona, because Okewinge was like 6.5 hours away in New Mexico. And like my goal was to, make pottery that was from my grandmother's village, that style. But I didn't have access to the clays, and then I learned how to make like Navajo pottery. I got into, through Kelly Hayes Gilpin, I got into replicating organic painted black and white pottery. that is well known from Mesa Verde and also the northeastern Arizona ancestral Puebloans. So from all those experiences, I have a really good grasp of the technological choices or styles that are involved in making different kinds of pottery. And as I was trying to come up with a research topic, I was visiting museums in Santa Fe, and I realized I'm like these ancestral tewa pots really look like gobernador polychromes, both in design style and vessel forms, but they were totally technologically different. So I saw that there was opportunity to look into that, why that was. And in addition to that, as Woody and Wade mentioned, rewriting Native history, the pots themselves that I am looking at are part of a narrative about Navajo people that it's involved with a lot of narratives that are sort of, I don't know, you could go as far as saying offensive to traditional Navajo people. And some of those would be like rapid acculturation, the migration theory. And so I'm trying to look at it from another perspective and bring into it the Native point of view that there's actually evidence that there was a very long interaction with Pueblo people, and that this is one of the material phenomena that came out of that. And I think the timing has everything to do with that, because there's evidence of tradeware that are like from hundreds of years earlier, but it's like during the Spanish colonization of the northern Rio Grande, that's when these appear. And so I think that has something to do with their access to trade wares, and they might have begun to just produce it themselves. And in addition to that, in doing my research, I found out that not so much the painted style, but the vessel forms, they spread throughout most of the northern Southwest. They spread all the way to Hopi land. So I thought that was very interesting also. And those vessel forms originated on the Pajarito Plateau in Tewa country. So that my research is sort of near and dear to me and part of me.
Thanks, Tim. And if you ever get a chance to see any of Tim's reproductions, they're pretty awesome. He does traditional firings, and they look just like the kind of the ancestral wares that he tries to replicate. It's pretty cool. So next we have Nick. I'll allow you to, if you could, just reintroduce yourselves and talk a little bit about the work you do.
Good late afternoon, everyone. Yeah, so sorry I'm a little red. I was out in the sun and globe doing some consultation stuff with BHP about some mining stuff out here with various tribal folks all afternoon. So so it was interesting. I might bring up some of that today because I think it's important to what we're going to talk about. But yeah, my research interests. So let's see. So I got into archaeology, I guess I want to say when I started interning with my TIPO back in the day, Mark Altaha, and we basically he came back from the military and we kind of started together at White Mountain, kind of learning different kind of components of archaeology, heritage preservation, whatnot. And from that, I actually, I wasn't really interested that, I was interested in history and the past, but not so much archaeology. I thought it was, cool, but I really didn't know what I wanted to do, I think. And so I kind of just, started talking more with John Welch, who is, at Simon Fraser now, who's our former TIPO. And he was like, well, you should, maybe attend this field school. And so I did. It was the University of Arizona Field School in collaboration with White Mountain Apache Tribe. And I did. So I kind of grew more of an appreciation, I guess, for archaeology. And so, but I found my interest moving more toward the cultural anthropological side in terms of doing oral interviews and doing ethnographic work. So from that, I did a master's thesis on Apache scout camps. And then I did a Ph.D. work in association with the Chiricahua mountainscape in southern Arizona, working together collectively with various Apache tribes to better understand the Apache kind of presence within the Chiricahua mountainscape in the historical period. And that was just really fascinating. I mean, that is because a lot of archaeology, I was there at Coronado National Forest as a tribal liaison / archaeologist, but when you went through the site forms, all I was seeing was like Apache ? Apache probable site. And so I really wanted to better understand my ancestors' association to this landscape. So I invited, these folks out, and it was just amazing how these stories, these ceremonies, these, the ways that folks were associating and relating to the landscape came alive by just through simple field visitation. And so I think that's kind of put me on a trajectory to where I am now in terms of really kind of grounding myself in sovereignty-based research and research that contributes to self-determination for Indigenous nations, and really just trying to foreground Indigenous ways of knowing. I call them institutions. I don't, we use these buzzwords so much in anthropology, archaeology, like epistemology, ontology. I think institution is better because it relates back to a law, an established law given down by creator. It's something that is given to us a long time ago that allows us to kind of have these reciprocal bonds with environment, nature, and with ourselves within this kind of world we live. And so from that, I try to kind of ground my research in any way I can. So hopefully I can talk about this a bit more, but that's just a brief introduction. So
thanks, Nick. I appreciate that that distinction you made about ways of knowing and like kind of institutions of knowing. I think that's a better way to describe Indigenous knowledge. So thanks for that insight. Kurly, if you would, same thing, just talk a little bit more about yourself, whatever you'd like to relay to the audience. It's time's for you.
Sure. So Piali Piali, Nochime, Juan Noampoyowan, Notoka Tlapyoyawa. Hello, everyone. Everyone here, all my friends. My name is Tlapyoyawa. I want to start by saying thank you to Woody for putting this together, for inviting all of us here. So I work for a CRM company doing cultural resource management. I'm a supervisory archaeologist for Oaken Consulting Solutions, but I'm also the founder of the Mesoamerican Arts Institute, Chimalli, Institute of Mesoamerican Arts. And our focus is on language revitalization, reviving the ball game, and just raising awareness of the contributions made by Mesoamericans to the area, the region that is now known as New Mexico. So my research focuses on Mesoamerica, Central Mexico, the American Southwest, and the interchange between the two regions, ranging back from trade with ancestral Pueblo people all the way up through the colonial period, and just telling these stories of the impact, contributions, influence that Mesoamericans made to this region. This is part of my research because I'm connected to it, right? It's how my family got here. We were I'm the descendant of what's been called Mesoamerican indigenous mercenaries who were brought to New Mexico basically to colonize. And this is a story that doesn't really get told in the schools. It's really left in the dark. People kind of ignore it. And this idea that New Mexico was settled by all of these Spaniards who came up and established themselves, and all these, you know, modern Hispanos are like the descendants of pure blood Spaniards. This fantasy heritage that basically exists in New Mexico. The work that I do is about pulling back those layers of that onion and getting down to the actual truth, and just sort of shedding a light on my ancestry, my people, and the experiences that they had, whether good or bad, right? Just looking back at what happened historically and the impacts that we had on this region. So that's the focus of my personal research. We're also part of, I'm also part of an international organization that's reviving the ball game. And I think this is important because if you look at, I think the northernmost rubber balls were found in Arizona. So this game made its way up pretty far. And as far as I know, there are at least 2 Casas Grandes style ball courts in New Mexico itself. So we know that the game was played up in this region. So we see it as a way of reintroducing the game to this region. Whenever I talk to Pueblo relatives, Navajo relatives, Apache relatives, I always tell them, you know, before the first white man set foot on this land, our ancestors already knew each other. We were already trading with each other. We were already talking with each other. So I think I see my work as part of rebuilding that connection and creating these bridges. So as an archaeologist working in New Mexico, I see it as just basically protecting the cultural heritage of this state. And it's something that I take very seriously.
Thanks, Kurly. And I appreciate the work you do to shed light on that kind of an important aspect of the history of the Southwest, which is often overlooked, the contributions of the indigenous peoples south of the US border. There tends to be in archaeology and American culture a separation between indigenous people in North America and indigenous people south of the border, right, as something completely different. But I like how the work you do kind of erases that line and looks at the contribution of indigenous people as a whole, just from a different region in what is now North America. And appreciate the work that you do. So I know you guys have all framed your introductions around kind of your own unique backgrounds and how you were raised and the roots of kind of yourselves as people, how you contribute to the work that you do. And I know we're all working in different contexts and different kind of periods of North American archaeology or history, however you want to frame it. And I know there's terms that are often thrown around out there in archaeology and in academia, such as decolonize or anti-colonial, post-colonial, indigenous, indigenize, however you frame it. Like, in what ways do you frame the work that you do? I tend to see decolonization as more of a theory rather than an outcome, because to truly decolonize, right, you'd have to binge and purge anything colonial. And that has happened in the past with Native folks, and like with the Pueblo Revolt, for example. And so I tend to use indigenize in my work, adding indigenous perspectives like Nick talked about, kind of foregrounding the work you do based in your understanding of your own cultures. So I'd be interested to know like how your work as an archaeologist, as a cultural practitioner, as a cultural resource manager, like how you frame the work you do, and how does that work align or contribute to alternative ways to make archaeology better, and other practices such as museums, for example. So Wade, I'll just start with you if you want to address that question, or anybody really, and I can repeat it if you like.
Sure, yeah. Well, I think, at least I sort of showed my hand at the start. I think for me, it's a question of reclamation more than anything else. I think, so as I sort of hinted at, but for me, my research is focused on the colonial period, but a key part of what I've done was to understand Navajo herding. I had to, because it's become such a key part of traditional Diné culture today, I went and herded sheep with some of my relatives for, a good chunk of the year to get a better understanding for, a better understanding of how the practices were done, why they were done, how this tradition has changed from even just, a generation or two ago. Talking to my siblings, my cousins, my aunts and uncles, other relatives, other folks. And I think that process highlighted to me that it is a process of reclamation and rewriting. For me, and I think for many of you guys here, right, this idea of indigenous archaeology in particular is it comes out of a movement in the 90s, and there's the key set of articles by Sonia Adelaide and others, and the sort of indigenous archaeology and decolonizing archaeology. And one of the things that I've always sort of puzzled about is sort of how to put those ideas into practice, how to actually go about doing an archaeology that is mindful of my own cultural beliefs as a Diné person, but also the questions I want to ask and the things I'm interested in. And so part of that for me has been trying to find, to accept some limitations on my work, to sort of willingly put sets of limits, right? And I think, knowing a lot of what the rest of you guys do, I think there are some similarities, right? I haven't done excavations, everything's been survey and ethnographic work, and the closest I've gotten was taking, soil samples, like single kind of, they look like little test tubes essentially of soil in an attempt to see if I could find subsurface traces, and trying to basically make my work as minimally intrusive as possible, but still capable of addressing these questions, because I feel that, as I said earlier, there has been a substantial bias in the way that history has framed the Native experience. And I think archaeology has been a key part of that, right? Because after a certain point, archaeologists emerge as the experts, the people whose voice and sway and input sort of creates what gets termed as prehistory, I guess, which is an unfortunate choice of words, right? But it completely discounts the Native voice and Native experience. And I think archaeology, if done in a more open-minded way, is really ideally suited to getting at that. And I think this is something that maybe we can return to later, but one of the problems though is that archaeology has been sort of fraught with, at least I feel, has been fraught with a lot of baggage over the past century, in terms of people showing up, digging them up a bunch of stuff, taking it back to the East Coast, putting it in museums, going about and doing all sorts of analyses and things that really don't respect the viewpoints of traditional people. And there are justifications that are put out there, in part because maybe there's some sort of gap as archaeologists see it. But on the other hand, you have Native people who say that there are connections, there are, these links between the past and the present, and that the only way, I think the only way for me that archaeology is going to overcome this issue is to be more open to Indigenous voices, and to, if not decolonize, I think, Woody's point is well taken, is to indigenize, and I think too, the important point is that's not just for Indigenous people. but it's a collaborative process that involves multiple parties.
Yeah, Wade, you're spot on with that. Your comment about the kind of terrible legacy that archaeology has in Native communities, and much of that is represented by museums. You know, they're the kind of the warehouses of what early archaeology was, and in some cases still is. So I appreciate those comments. Tim, if you want to follow up with any of what Wade said, the original question was why and how does some of the work that you do align with and or contribute to alternative ways to a better archaeology? So Tim, if you'd like to respond.
Yeah, so I've already mentioned my dissertation work. And with that work, I chose to work with an existing collection rather than do more excavation. And it's a collection that was sitting on the shelves since like 1941 or something. And it's been just sitting there. So that's a testament to the way Western anthropologists and archaeologists treat native materials and even natives themselves. On the other hand, I have extensive experience excavating. My first experience was across the river from my hometown with Dr. Charles Adams. And that's where I met Kelly Hayes Gilpin. She was the ceramic analyst. But I worked on Chuck's first grad student, Lisa Young. They were testing a pit house village because it was a new state park that was being established, and it was right next to the visitor center. And then I worked for years and years with the Navajo Nation Archaeology Department, and most road projects required excavation because unlike power lines, water lines, to make the road safe, you can't always reroute around the site. And I worked for them for 10 years. And now I'm a field archaeologist at Crow Canyon Archaeological Center. And I know there's like, there are native archaeologists who won't excavate at all. But I sort of see it as like me being there has, I'm like witness to make sure that they're being, that if they're, you know, whatever is happening, it's happening sort of respectfully, and people aren't just, you know, well, I don't know. I guess sometimes the reasons for excavating are sort of questionable, but like working for the Navajo Nation Archaeology Department, you know, we worked on N16 road. Those people were waiting for it was like probably like 45 miles of dirt road to their community. And, you know, our work helped them get a paved road. And here at Crow Canyon, I have an opportunity to make archaeology better because I help teach participants. We have field school participants, we have interns, and like today is our first day of our field school. And one of the things I like to bring up when I'm teaching them is what we've all been talking about, the institutions, and I always sort of frame it as, you know, the archaeology is a science, and people a lot of times, especially if they don't have any other experience other than mainstream American culture, think that science is the final word, it's the final truth, but it is still culturally, it's still cultural in that Western science is based on these thoughts that make sense to if you're raised that way, you know, a cosmic clock and progress and all these things, linear time. And I always like to bring up Gregory Kete's native science, his notions of native science, which I think, and it's basically, I think the subtitle is The Science of Interrelationships. And that's what Western science doesn't see because everything is so siloed, biology, you know, and it's like for natives, it's everything, and everything is interrelated. And that's what I try to teach this new generation of archaeologists, because a lot of them aren't from the Southwest. And you know, this is probably the first time they might be interacting with the native person. And so that's what I try to do. I try to teach them that there are many different ways of viewing viewing this work. And there's something else I was going to mention. I forgot, so I'll just let the next person go.
Thanks, Tim. And I guess Kurly, I have a kind of a different way of asking you the question that I posed to the others. I'm really intrigued by the work that you do to kind of shed light on the contributions of indigenous peoples in however we've come to terms with understanding the indigenous people in Central or South America. And I know you talked about the ball court and revitalizing that, and just talk a little bit more about some of the work that you're doing, how that kind of brings to light the contributions of Mesoamerican indigenous peoples, their contributions to not just North America, but like just in general. Like I'm really intrigued by how you're able to kind of really highlight those contributions in your own unique way. If you could just talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. So the approach that I take is just informing people. Okay, so we live in New Mexico, and there's a lot of these things in New Mexico that superficially people view as like Hispanic, right? Whether they're foodways or systems of agriculture. But what I do is I try to go further into those things, like for example, the acequia. You know, a lot of New Mexicans are familiar with the acequia systems, and what I try to bring to light is the fact that, you know, this technology, because it always gets framed as, well, this is this Moorish/Spanish technology that was brought here, right? And the hydraulic systems that were already in existence here related to agriculture get completely left out of the picture. So for example, in Mexico, there were these vast systems that were used to pump in water, drinking water, to the cities, because, you know, Mexico City was a large city state, and they were called apantli. And the way it worked was there was the way apantli, which was the main waterway, and then it was filtered off into individual communities, and this water was divided up, and everybody had a right to access to the water. And when the Spaniards came, they saw these systems, apantli, and they reminded them of the acequias that they had seen, that the Moors had developed. So basically they rebranded this indigenous technology with a name that they were more familiar with, but the technology stayed the same, right? These people came up, and some of the first acequias that were dug in New Mexico, set up during the colonial period, were done by Tlaxcaltecas, Mixtecas, Mexicas, Purépechas, who were brought up as foot soldiers by the Spanish to do the hard labor and to do the fighting. So these systems that were set up were done by Mesoamericans. And there's a word in Nahuatl tekyo means communal labor. And it's when a community gets together, and it's compulsory labor, right? Everybody has to come in and contribute to this one project. And this exists today in northern New Mexico. They call the act of getting together to clean the acequias is called a tekyo. So it's like this system, this system of kinship, the system of organizing that's completely indigenous, but has been totally repainted as something European or Arabic, and it's anything but indigenous. Basically, that the historians tend not to, especially New Mexican Hispanic historians, don't want to give the credit to indigenous people. There's like this unspoken rule, right? Anything but Mexican, anything but Indian from Mexico. We want to ignore that. But all of these systems, the foods that we eat, right? The system, the acequia systems, we have this concept that we talk to each other. When you hear Chicanos speak to each other, and if you share the same name, we use the term tocayo, which means namesake, but it's a Nahuatl word. And in Nahuatl, it literally means you have the same name as I do, but it means much more than that, right? There's deep philosophical systems of kinship that work within that word. And this system is preserved today. Like, it still holds that meaning. It's just the label of what it's called has been erased. So my work is like shedding the light on those things. Why do we do this? Why do we hold this feast day on this day, right? Like, why were the waters blessed on May 15th? And then in honor of San Isidro? Well, in Mexico, San Isidro is how our ancestors hid their veneration of Tlaloc and Chalchutlique, which were the waterways. So we were able to take our veneration and our respect for the waterways and the rain, because this sets off the wet season in Mexico for agriculture. And so we took those rituals, those rites, and we buried them in Catholicism, and we gave them this veneer that we had converted. But in actuality, we were carrying out our traditions just with the veneer of being Catholics. So it's just getting people, talking to people with what they already know. So, okay, you're familiar with the acequia systems, you're familiar with these words, these systems of kinship, these ceremonies, these feast days. So let's get into the weeds and let's dig a little bit deeper, and let's find out where these things actually came from. And more often than not, it gets people really excited because they'd never heard this before. They're like, really? Oh, so that's why my grandma said that, or that's why we do this on this day. I had no idea that that's where this came from. And so it's just like opening up this doorway to get people to realize where a lot of these traditions came from. And they're all, especially if you're a Chicano, Chicana from New Mexico, odds are you descend from these Mesoamerican peoples, depending on when your family got here, right? If your family arrived in this time period, odds are your ancestors were these people. So it's getting people to reconnect. Like, I like that you use indigenize. I really like that word. I use indigenize and re-indigenize, I like to tell people, because a lot of these times we've lost the connection of knowing that these are even indigenous things that we're practicing. So it's re-indigenizing. And I like that a lot because it's more proactive, decolonial, anti-colonial. Those seems like reactions to me. And like you said, theoretical. But if it's indigenizing, it's like we're taking what we have and we're infusing something with it, and we're reclaiming it and making it meaningful on our terms instead of reacting to systems that other people have set up for us. I hope that answer was okay.
No, that was awesome. And I appreciate the, having grown up in northern New Mexico in San Ildefonso, Pueblo, we grow up with these myths, I guess, like you're saying, like with the acequias, for example. We were often told that it was a Spanish introduction, right? And it's really cool to hear you doing the labor to unpack the meanings of these words, these things, and they really go back to a contribution from indigenous folks from further south who brought those kind of technologies up north, many of which are just commonplace words and things that we use today, but we just gloss over that contribution from those indigenous folks, and they've been accepted as European or Hispanic. So it's really cool the way you unpack all that, and I really appreciate it as somebody who grew up in northern New Mexico, because I got to rethink a lot of these things that I've become familiar with that I think are either Hispanic in origin or European in origin, when they're actually really a contribution by indigenous folks further south. So thanks, Kurly. That's really awesome. So Nick, if you would, like, going forward, how do you see the future of some of the work that you do? And what are some of the necessary steps to keep moving towards better practices in archaeology? What are some changes that need to happen in laws and practice and policy that would help usher in a new generation of archaeology and archaeologists?
Change is hard. And I think, it's so hard fighting the man. And it goes back to power and how settler colonialism is real. It's very how folks engage us, I think, as indigenous people still, even in our own disciplines, archaeology. And I think getting beyond settler colonial mindsets of what, I'll use my own experience, an Inde should and needs to be, really is the first step. And so I have a couple quotes from today, just from talking to BHP. BHP is the ones who destroyed, Junca Gorge over there in Australia. I asked them that question straight up today. I was like, so what are you doing different with your relationships with indigenous folks internationally? You're trying to establish a mine here in Arizona. So what are you doing different? What did you learn from that experience, basically? And so they said they had a couple things going on, but I wrote down a quote, said, start with the tribes first. And so I've been thinking about that. And that was only a couple hours ago, that conversation, but that, I think that's really good. But if that's put into practice in reality, and it's something that we can embrace within our own structural system as archaeologists, whether it be, contract archaeology, academic archaeology, tribal archaeology, whatever we do, there's got to be this component that moves us beyond just people who consult sometimes, or folks who are there as stakeholders. There's got to be that power dynamic that shifts back to tribal folks in every arena of archaeology. And I think because we use so much terminology, like I mentioned, decolonization, indigenization, post-colonialism. I mean, there's other ways I think we got to engage things in terms of like demystifying what the public thinks about indigenous folks in the Southwest and in North America in general, because the dominance of archaeology has been, a part of, settler colonialism for a long time. And me, my own work, it's really hard to, being the only person who was in grad school. Carrie Thompson, my department chair, she was there with me at U of A. And we talk about this sometimes. We talk about our engagement, how the lack of engagement or the lack of understanding that folks had in terms of, what we were coming at as indigenous archaeologists. And so I think, I really love, what Kurly brings up in terms of these deep philosophical components of language and terminologies that we have in our own kind of systems of knowing as indigenous people, because that is where things are at. So sorry, there's something going on outside my window, but I think we need to revisit these kinds of things and use our own language as keys to theory, as keys to institutions, like I mentioned, as keys to, indigenize the academy in ways that we feel are necessary. And so I use concepts like gojo, ni, these types of things. And ni is inseparability of land and mind. Gojo is this kind of arriving at a place of beauty, balance, and harmony within Apache traditions. And if we can do this as archaeologists and work together collectively, then I think there's really heartfelt research that can happen where we change the game in a lot of ways. And a lot of us are inspired by, the early stuff by, Watkins and Adelaide from early 2000s. And, this generation, I think, is really in a interesting time right now where we can do really, really cool work that adds on to what those folks were saying in the beginning, but at the same time, and we can indigenize in various ways that really do bring our own histories and our own chronologies, our own ways of looking at the past forward that really, deepens the kind of fight against the structure and the systemic kind of components of colonialism within our discipline, because they're very much there. And I wrote a couple articles about this recently, and I think it's just, as indigenous archaeologists, we're in the field. We hear about this stuff all the time. We feel it. We experience it at levels that are there that other, white archaeologists can't, see sometimes. And whether that be kind of racist comments, whether that be kind of assumptions about our culture, essentialisms, it's always there. It's omnipresent. It lives with us as indigenous folks. And I think helping, get beyond those things by using our own terminology, our own, ways of looking at the world. I want to talk about my kind of use of pollen these days and how our relationality with the world and how we associate back to the history in the past and Mother Earth is tied so much to just how we pray and we approach Mother Earth rather than, using a trowel, which, we don't use trowels at White Mountain. I mean, that's not a part of our archaeological tool. Archaeo tools are just community well-being and healing and reconciliation. It's not, it's not this tool that's been used to dig up our ancestors for years and extract them and take them to museums and put them on display or put them there as prisoners for so long. It's this understanding that it's community-based. It's something that we need to embrace, and archaeologists need to see that sometimes in terms of how we utilize our own tools to move forward in the present. So not sure if that was a rant or that was an answer, but whatever.
It worked, man. And
that was awesome.
Yeah, and I think what you're speaking to is the highly contextual nature of the work that we all engage ourselves in, and we all work in different cultural contexts, right? And I think what Nick is highlighting is that I certainly bring to my own work my understanding of my cultures and traditions, and I always foreground any work I do with that at the front, right? Just like Nick is doing with White Mountain Apache kind of ways of understanding the world, really. So I can appreciate, and I wholly agree that we need to engage archaeology or any of the work we do with that mindset, that indigenous mindset, whatever, if it's Apache, if it's Nawa, if it's Diné, if it's Pueblo, whatever it might be, we need to make it our own. And this is not just true with archaeology, but I have people who are friends who are social workers or who are lawyers, and we all have to bring that same mindset to the work we do, no matter what field we're in. So I appreciate those comments, Nick. It's close to 6 o'clock, and we have a few questions in the chat, and I think I'll direct some of these at Wade, because he talked about actually going out into the field and working with community folks. So there's a question here in the chat. I'll just read it outright. So with the history of archaeology and Native communities being so fraught with violations of trust and disrespect, how do you approach explaining what you do to your community or even to your family? Do you face any pushback from your communities about pursuing this career path? So Wade, I'll just direct this at you, because you talked about being in the field, working with folk, working with farmers. You present yourself as an archaeologist, obviously doing this work. What kind of reactions do you get?
Well, the interesting thing is that at least, and I think I said it at the outset, is that, right, I've been trained in kind of the American anthropological archaeology, but when it boils down to it, I view my work as historical, which I think is actually one way of starting to address the problems people have had, at least on the Navajo Nation. I think, at least for Navajo community, I would say there's probably my feel in conversations with other folks is that there's, and, you know, Tim, chime in please if you have other things to add, but as working for NAD. But I feel like on the Navajo Nation, when people hear about archaeology, the first things that come to mind are sort of pop culture, right? Sort of Indiana Jones and this kind of this fictitious world of what archaeology is. The second case is, you know, one of this kind of trauma, this history of people showing up, of hiring Navajo workers, right? Navajos have been involved in archaeological research since the earliest days. You know, Richard Weatherald didn't excavate Chaco. It was, you know, the dozens of Navajos and Zuni folks that he employed, people that contributed their knowledge to his endeavors. And over the years, over the decades, you know, Southwestern archaeology has benefited from the input of Navajo people. But there's been a lot kind of wrapped up in that in part, and I know Nick has written a bit about this too, right? At least in Navajo and Apache culture, a lot of these things are to be avoided, if at all possible, to stay away from these sorts of sites, unless there is some sort of overriding or sort of beneficial principle that could be derived from that work. And I think actually, and then the last point, the third point is that at least on the Navajo Nation, right, a lot of the difficulty in getting development started is often linked back to archaeology. And so people emerge with a generally negative view of archaeology at the start. Just sort of, I think the layperson's view is either pop culture, sort of the base sort of traditional view that, you know, you should avoid it, you should respect it by avoiding it, unless there is something that can benefit us from it. Or the final view is, you know, I can't get my home site lease, or I still don't have water, I still don't have electricity, and it was held up because of this archaeological project. And so that sets a hard baseline to overcome. And I think part of the challenge has been to demonstrate to people, and I think this is for in various indigenous communities more broadly, is part of it is to demonstrate the utility of archaeological work, and particularly in indigenous archaeology that takes perhaps certain restrictions, certain mindsets, and puts them into play such that, you know, you can do your best to address these concerns and still, you know, arrive at things that are beneficial, whether that benefit is material, sort of infrastructure based, right? Like CRM, you know, we need these projects for modern economies and indigenous communities, or whether it is the cultural, the historical, the making those links that Kurly talked about. You know, I think there is a lot of interest, I feel, in traditional histories and the like. And as I said earlier, I think archaeology is well suited to bringing to light kind of incontrovertible evidence of those activities that can be tied to histories, can be tied to oral traditions, and then you get this much richer picture that has been beaten down by boarding schools, language loss, greater incorporation into the American world or the Western world. So I think that's the long answer. And for those of you that have ever heard me talk, the long answer is what you're going to get. But I think the short answer is that it's difficult, but it takes investment. It takes at its core personal investment and an attitude that, you know, you want to overcome these things, and you need to figure out how to make that argument as best you can.
Yeah, I think we've all kind of dealt with these challenges in working with our own communities. I certainly have in my work, and I think I always will, as long as I do archaeology or I'm in this field. And I think Kurly, I have a question for you. There's another question in the chat related to how you bring community together to participate in some of the things that you're engaged with, whether that's with archaeology or with revitalizing certain aspects of your indigenous culture. Just if you would just chat about some of those ways where you're engaging those descendant communities.
Sure.
Some of the
So I think, I mean, personally, like I agree with everything Wade said, and I think that was really well put. And to that, to the point of what he was saying, I think public engagement is really, really important, because most of our people don't even, like he was saying, the references like pop culture or what they know about the destructive aspects of archaeology, the bad history, like where they only know that they don't even know that there are indigenous archaeologists, right? So I think engaging the public in a way that's meaningful and just explaining to people like why this is important, you know, why what we're doing is important, you know, why you shouldn't just, and not just, you know, to indigenous people, but to people in general, you know, why you shouldn't be picking up these artifacts and taking them home with you. People don't even understand that, because they don't understand the value of leaving those things alone. And you know, the information that could be obtained, not from both a cultural perspective, from a historical perspective, from, you know, engaging with descendant communities. And I think a word that gets thrown around a lot is consultation, right? Like it's written into the laws, right? They have to do a consultation, but a consultation could be anything, right? It could just be a letter that they wrote to say, we're going to do this, and if you don't want us to do it, respond by this date. And that passes for a consultation, when really what they need is collaboration and active participation of descendant communities into the research design. Like, how many times have descendant communities been asked about research design? And, you know, what's the best way we can go about this thing respectfully and in a way that's meaningful and not destructive? And I don't think that ever happens. I think that the SAAs, when the SAAs was here in Albuquerque, it was a huge missed opportunity to engage with local indigenous people, because they could have made the SAAs free, right? Free admission to descendant communities. All of these people who are actually stakeholders in the archaeology that's being done in New Mexico should have been invited to the SAAs. I mean, I don't even know if that was considered, but to me, that seems like a huge missed opportunity. And I think once we engage with people and start telling them like, well, this is why this work is important and meaningful to our communities, we need to have a say. You know, I think that's how you get community involved, is you say, well, who do we want telling our stories, right? Should we have a hand in telling our own stories? Because I think we do. And most people would agree with that. Yes. The way of going about it, everybody probably has a different opinion, and everybody should have the opportunity to have their opinions be heard. But we need to involve communities and say, okay, well, if this is what we want to do, what's the best way to go about doing it? And we're dealing not with some abstract, you know, data collection or whatever, but we're dealing with actually, these are our ancestors, right? This is what we're doing right now. It's how it's connecting us to our ancestors in a way that's meaningful. So what we do is we approach our people and we just try to get them. I mean, the easiest way to do it is just to get them excited about finding stuff out that they've never known before. And once you could get that not like a hook, but you know, you capture their attention somehow that's interesting and meaningful to them, then you could build on that. You know, what our ancestors did. Like when I tell people, did you know that there are 2 ball courts in Southwest New Mexico that New Mexico State has been researching? Most people don't know that. So they get excited, right? And it's like, well, let's check it out. Would you like to see how the ball game works? You know, would you like to play it? And then we go into, did you know our ancestors created rubber and came up with their own way of vulcanizing rubber? Like nobody ever learns these things, but we tend to look at archaeology as sort of a almost like an abstract that is outside of the purview of our daily existence. When I tell people that I'm an archaeologist, especially other Native people, I could tell some people are like, well, and then they start looking at me side-eyed, like, I don't know if I should trust this guy. But you know, when we tell them, well, actually what we're doing here is we're trying to protect this site, because I do CRM work. So, you know, we're trying to come up with a way that they could get this project built without disturbing this site. And that's my objective personally as an archaeologist, is to protect that site. And so it kind of, you know, people start to come around. I try to stay away from, you know, disturbing anything unnecessarily. And I think that's something that we all share. We don't want to disturb any, because it's, you know, excavation is a destructive process, right? We don't want to destroy things, but we can use what we already have, you know, without excavating anymore. There's plenty of data already out there that we can use to enrich our communities and teach them about connections to the past. And especially I see when people learn that, you know, I've seen the thumbprints on the inside of ceramic vessels, and you explain to somebody like, yeah, you know, you hold that in your hand, and I'm probably the first person to touch this since whoever made it or whoever used it last. And there's just like this connection with that artifact that I don't think non-natives experience.
Could I chime in?
I got something.
Do it. Oh, go.
So
go.
I just want, I guess I want to talk about what both Kurly and Wade talked about. Working for the Navajo Nation for so long, there are all those issues that Wade talked about. And someone asked about if we get pushback from families. Early in my career, I did. It was, I think I even got more pushback from my wife's family. But they, you know, eventually came around and were like, well, actually, we'd rather have him doing some of this work than someone who has no knowledge about it or holds at least some respect for these sites. And we're working here at Crow Canyon. We do, one of our missions is public archaeology, and we have been trying to create curriculums for both Ute and Navajo school children, which is pretty hard because, you know, especially for Navajo, you don't want them around any artifacts or, you know, and one of my ideas is, you know, well, if they can't be around art, there's so much more to archaeology. It's like, why not teach them why archaeology is necessary on the reservation? Why your parent or uncle complains about how archaeology is holding up his home site, you know, teaching them that Section 106 process, because since they're living on a reservation, they will constantly have to deal with that process. And then going back to public archaeology, I sort of feel that indigenous archaeology and public archaeology are parallel. The main point is that you're making archaeology relevant to the public that you're talking to. And it's just, the difference is to indigenous publics, indigenous communities, they might not be interested in the same things most archaeologists are. You know, they might not be interested in hard dates and, you know, they may be interested in something totally different. So for example, here, there's the Pueblo farming project, and that's like the only project here that was the research design came out of collaboration with the Hopi tribe. And their question was, do our varieties of corn and dry farming work up here in the Mesa Verde area? And it's been an ongoing project. There's a bunch of test plots and they collect data. And so we also strive to give indigenous voices a platform. But even so, it's like, I think it can be done in a better way because it still sometimes sort of feels extractive, and it's like the reciprocal part of the relationship isn't there like as well as it could be. and I've been pushing that aspect of it. You know, we always ask people to come up here. It's like, have we gone to a feast day? You know, have we visited a Native community? You know, our staff that works here, or even if we, you know, we talked about service projects, maybe doing home site leases, you know, surveying, getting permitted, and instead of having participants dig, actually do archaeology that contributes to the community.
Thanks, Tim. I appreciate those comments, like both from you and Kurly, and I really appreciate Kurly's point on this notion of consultation being a form of engagement. It's not really, and I take your points to heart about like really creating partnerships and engaging with communities, which goes far beyond consultation. So I want to be mindful of everybody's time here, but there's one more question that I think should be addressed. It's in the chat from an anonymous attendee, and I'll just throw this to Nick because he hasn't talked in a while. And it goes, how do we begin to address how Indigenous data, knowledge really, is weighed against the science of our Anglo counterparts? Traditional ecological knowledge is still viewed by some as creationism and not science, so it gets weighed differently in the process. So how do you reconcile those viewpoints within a discipline that don't really give weight to what we see as Indigenous institutions as compared to Western ways of knowing?
That's a really good question that I've thought about in the past, and I think it goes back to just, you know, what I was stating about what we gauge as fact, what we gauge as truth in our discipline. You know, it's, why does it have to be objective? Why does it have to be materialistic sometimes to actually be something that is real in a lot of contexts? And I think this is, you know, the issue that ties back to a lot of constructs in reference to, you know, even look at the NHPA guidelines for traditional cultural properties and those types of things. You know, there's different criteria to identify what makes something important, right? But there are other things there that, you know, we engage with, we on an everyday basis, we kind of form our relationships to as Indigenous people that are not usually brought to the table as equal, right? And so I actually have another quote from today's meeting, which I thought kind of hits on this. This woman, Bernadette, who's a tribal monitor over here, she said, you know, a lot of times she's out in the field, she'll recognize, they'll revisit sites after archaeologists have already went over and kind of recorded them. The tribal monitors will go back and revisit them to record, you know, re-record to see what their perceptions are. And she said, it's something to us, it's nothing to them. And so, you know, think about that. I think that's, you know, what drives a lot of archaeology these days in terms of site forms, in terms of, you know, what we give, you know, what we kind of consider knowledge, what we consider information that is useful for, you know, protection and preservation of certain sites. And so it's really difficult to weigh these things when we still sit in this mindset of, you know, Native oral tradition is not as valid as, you know, this, you know, roasting pit that's here because, you know, it's not a material component of the landscape. And so it's not a human construct that ties back to a culture in our terms, right? And so in this sense, I think we still need to re-educate folks in so many ways. I think that's why, you know, I'm in education, and it's so powerful when we can start off so early with students at undergrad levels and freshman levels, even, and sophomores at 200, 100 level classes. By we teach them these things right off the bat, and don't wait till they get to the 400, you know, level classes or even grad school. You know, let's talk about, you know, what is important to folks in terms of the intangibles, the tangibles, and how Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous science is equally valid. Because a lot of these students, I mean, that I go through our program, they really have little exposure still to Native American communities to issues across the board. And so it's something that we really need to, go back to the youth from K through 12 to really, center our knowledge systems right off the bat to allow, folks that early on cultivation of, a different form of knowledge that they are taught traditionally in schools. And so I think that's something that we need to do, but it's really hard. I think it's an ongoing issue with, I can't explain something in my knowledge sometimes or in my cultural language to an outsider because sometimes they won't get understanding the full essence of what I'm trying to say or how that ties back to my community in a lot of ways. And so a lot of folks quote Keith Basso from my own reservation and Basso wrote this amazing book about place-based associations and landscape, right? But there's so much there, I think, that folks miss because they get so fascinated by this white ethnographer going in and recording Apache history and place names and topography, but they don't really look at the deeper connections of those philosophies that these elders, their knowledge, put forward. And so I think as archaeologists, if we go back and mine that a little bit, we can really kind of form a better understanding of how we push traditional ecological knowledge, we push traditional knowledge, we push, indigenous-based, associations to place. I'm Apache and I associate to place a lot. So in that sense, to how we understand the world in a lot of ways. And so, and that kind of, I think, can help us kind of get beyond archaeology as a science and archaeology more as humanistic, right? So.
Thanks, Nick. I think that's a perfect way to close out the session. We're at 6:20 now. And there's a couple questions in the chat that we didn't get to. And I think, Kurly, you addressed at least one question in the chat. Maybe that person will reach out to you. We could spend easily an hour with each of these people, right? They're all sharp guys. And I do realize that these all are guys, male Indigenous archaeologists. And that is on purpose. So please stay tuned for part 2 of this series, where we will feature a panel of all women Indigenous archaeologists. I felt to really get the perspectives of women in the field, Indigenous women in the field, they needed a dedicated panel. So stay tuned next month. We're lining up that panel as we speak, and should be really insightful. So please come back in about a month or so. But everybody, thank you. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Mayak. Thank you, audience members, wherever you may be. Panelists, thank you. Appreciate it. Everybody, have a good evening.